Today we are continuing to talk about the 1960s with special emphasis on different social movements and changes that took place in the United States during the 1960s with a special emphasis on the end of the civil rights movement. All right, so the 1960s was a time of a ton of different movements. A lot of different social changes took place, and there were literally dozens of them. We can't spend all of class talking about them all. There are just so many, but we're going to focus on four in particular. All right, I'm going to try to give a balanced approach to these four movements and how they were so impactful in our society. So, of course, we have the civil rights movement. We've already talked a good deal about the civil rights movement. Today, we'll talk about the last years of it leading up to Martin Luther King's assassination. There was also a movement in the 60s called the Women's Lib movement, Women's Liberation, also known as the Feminist Movement. You also have the Redress movement, which we have talked about briefly before. That was when Japanese American citizens attempted to get an apology or reparations from the government for them being imprisoned during World War II. And then you also have the conservative movement. While a lot of the 1960s things became much more liberal, there also was a group of Americans becoming much more conservative, small government kind of people like that. All right. So these movements and others both created social change and really widened the generation gap for a lot of Americans. Like I said, the 1960s was a time of quite a bit of division in America, mostly because of things like the war in Vietnam and what different generations believed about the war, whether they were hawks or doves, and also because of movements like this and different views that older and younger people had about the merit of these movements or lack thereof. So first we're going to talk about the women's liberation movement or the feminist movement. And the book that really accelerated this movement came out in 1963. It was called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. You see in the picture there. Now this book said that women should not be expected to be housewives and mothers. That was kind of the social norm at the time. As you get married, you have children, and that's the way to your best life. Betty Friedan said that that's not the way to a woman's best life. Rather, she said that women should be encouraged to pursue careers like men are, even if that means not having any kids and not getting married. So she said that women should change their goals from wanting to find a husband and have kids to wanting to have a successful career, because if that's the goal for men, she said that should also be the goal for women. And that was her thesis of this book here, The Feminine Mystique. And her argument basically was that in her research, the single women she interviewed tended to be happier, having more fun than married mothers that she interviewed, just, in her experience, all right? So she compiled, systematized these writings in The Feminine Mystique. Millions of copies were sold, and a lot of people read this book and became what was known as feminists, all right? But not all women were behind this movement. One person who led in opposition to the feminist movement was a lady named Phyllis Shafi. And she and her followers argued that there was nothing wrong with the concept of patriarchy, which is basically a male-dominated society. She said as long as men treat women with respect, it's okay that men are in leadership roles and women should be all right with that. And she said that women should really, instead of saying that they want more out of life than kids and a husband, instead they should take pride in raising children and in taking care of their husbands. She said, why should women strive to be more like men when we could really be more like women? Because women can have children. They can do things that women can't do. All right. So she said that women should be proud of that instead of always wanting to do what men do. She was also a devout Christian, believed that God created women to be caregivers and that men should love and respect their wives for that reason. All right. So you have different things motivating both of these influential women, both Betty Friedan and Phyllis Shafi. And one controversial product of the feminist movement and really of advanced science was the birth control pill. And the birth control pill was controversial because in some ways it kind of limited the consequences of sex outside of marriage. Okay, so there's no such thing as sex without any consequences whatsoever, but taking a pill might does reduce your chance of getting pregnant. So it limited the consequences. It reduced the consequences of extramarital sex, and it also did something significant because it really separated the concept of sex from childbirth. really throughout all of human history, that's basically what it was. People said, don't have sex unless you are prepared or willing to have a baby. And then with the birth control pill, that changed a lot. That mindset kind of changed, saying that you don't need to think of it that way, and you can just take this pill and you can have fewer consequences with extramarital sex. So this was very controversial, obviously, because conservatives were not crazy about this idea. Liberals liked it, all right. And then this difference of opinion has always really existed. But the birth control pill really broadcasted that controversy, and that really became the cornerstone of the feminist movement. All right, now moving on to the redress movement of the 1960s. Like I said, we've touched on this a little bit before. This was the effort on the part of Japanese Americans to get an apology from the U.S. government about the way that their ancestors were treated during the Second World War with the Japanese American internment. Eventually, they did get an apology from President Ford in 1975, and eventually in 1988, President Reagan gave reparations, $20,000 of reparations, to all of the tens of thousands of survivors of the internment camps. All right. Another important social change that took place during the 60s were two Supreme Court decisions. One was called Gideon versus Wainwright, and the other was Miranda versus Arizona. And they both really affected individual liberties because they expanded the constitutional rights of people who were accused of crimes. You probably heard of your Miranda rights. All right, your Miranda rights say you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney, okay, et cetera, et cetera. That's what is said to you a lot of times whenever someone is arrested. Okay, so they're read to people upon arrest, basically telling them of their rights. It's the rights of the accused. And these were guaranteed with these Supreme Court cases, saying that if you are convicted of a crime, you don't have to incriminate yourself, just like the Fifth Amendment said. You have the right to have an attorney for someone to represent you, et cetera, et cetera. So it really clarified the rights of people who are accused of crimes. And one big centerpiece, really, of the social changes of the 1960s was called the counterculture. The counterculture of the 1960s. And this was basically a subculture within society. Not all that many people were a part of it. It was a pretty small percentage, kind of a fringe group, but it was really influential because it gained so much attention. It was just a subculture within society that basically created their own set of morals, values, and behavioral norms. Said that traditional values of society aren't working out so well, they need to go out the window, and we need to create our own set of morals, values, and behavioral norms. So in the 1950s, this was already kind of starting. Even in the late 40s, early 50s, this was starting, and it was known as the Beat generation. To be beat was basically what the term was at that time to fit this stereotype. And then in the 1960s, it became known as the hippie movement. I'm sure we've all heard of hippies, all right? We all have a picture in our head whenever we think of hippies. They typically wore different clothes, had different standards of hygiene, okay, didn't shower very much, very different sexual morals, and were heavily involved with the use of illegal drugs. And that was really something that really came to define the hippie movement, all right? They'd say things like peace, love, and rock and roll, or make love, not war, all right? Those are just some of the taglines that the hippies used. Sometimes they lived in communes, other times they lived in vans. Okay, you see that rainbow bus that a lot of those hippies are basically living out of there. And this was just a very different type of culture that America had never seen before, and it made a big impact on society. And one of the hallmark occasions of the hippie movement was the music festival Woodstock. It's probably something you may have heard of it. I know here at this school we have Dogstock. It's kind of named after Woodstock. And this was a 3-day music festival in the summer of 1969. And it was advertised as 3 days of peace and music. In fact, this summer, in August of 2019, there's going to be a 50-year anniversary of Woodstock at the same place, and like Miley Cyrus and the Killers and Jay-Z and a bunch of other singers are going to be there to kind of play this commemorative concert, all right? But at the original Woodstock in 1969, 400,000 people attended this music festival. That was insane, just so many people packed into one area. It was on a dairy farm in upstate New York, and a bunch of different musicians, including Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, performed throughout these 3 days. And really throughout this time, you have heavy drug use, sexual promiscuity, really pervading this festival. But remarkably, which is something that was shocking to everyone looking upon it, there was no violence. And people were like, holy cow, that all these people packed in together, a lot of them using drugs, and there's no violence at all. And so the hippies said, hey, maybe this is really what we need. This is what we need to kind of make our counterculture more mainstream and more accepted by society, since they see we're not all about violence. All right. So they planned another music festival called Altamont, and this was going to be like the Woodstock of the West Coast, but it could not have been more different from Woodstock. This was in December of '69, and because the hippies wanted to have another music festival on the West Coast, they did. But this event, attended by hundreds of thousands of people, again, it was really big, just like Woodstock. This resulted in a ton of violence. All right, you have people getting drunk, getting high, beating each other up. It actually resulted in 4 deaths and hundreds of people getting injured, just beaten up savagely by people, by the security, and by the people who were there celebrating the music. There you see in that picture kind of a famous picture of Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones. He's just shocked. He's on stage, just not even believing what he's seeing. You know, people are just going crazy on the drugs and beating each other up, and people had to be airlifted out of the Altamont Music Festival, and some people died. All right, so when people were a little bit maybe warming up to the idea of the hippie movement, saying, okay, maybe they're not as crazy as we think, since they had this festival at Woodstock and it was actually peaceful, maybe we can accept them a little bit. Then once Altamont happened, people were like, no, okay, we were right about the hippies all along. All this heavy drug use, this different lifestyle, it only leads to more violence and more death and craziness. All right, so this drug-induced violence really marked the end of the hippie movement, because a lot of people left the movement. A lot of their public support kind of went out the window, and a lot of hippies really had to kind of leave their communes and actually find jobs, which was their worst nightmare. But this is seen as the hippie movement was very short-lived, just in the late 1960s, and then it kind of fizzled out after Altamont. Finally here, the conservative movement. Just going to tell you a couple of books that were really influential in the early 1960s. A book called The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater kind of outlined the values of conservatives in America, which is kind of the opposite of hippies. And then A Choice Not an Echo by Phyllis Shafi. You know who Phyllis Shafi is. We just talked about her a minute ago. And remember, Barry Goldwater was the Republican candidate for president in 1964. And he lost to Lyndon B. Johnson, all right? So a lot of different movements happening at this time. But as we all know, probably the biggest and most influential movement was the Civil Rights Movement, okay? And we all know about that. We know how big it was and how it still affects our lives today positively. And throughout the 1960s, the group that most widely advocated the strategy of nonviolent peaceful protest was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by the one and only Martin Luther King Jr., right? He was kind of seen as the leader of the movement ever since his I Have a Dream speech that he gave at the March on Washington in 1963. And this strategy of nonviolent peaceful resistance, be it marches or sit-ins or bus boycotts, it was incredibly effective. And really every single positive change that resulted from the civil rights movement was a direct result of this strategy of the nonviolent peaceful resistance. All right, and one of the biggest milestones of the civil rights movement came in 1964 when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. There were a lot of components to this. I know we've already discussed it, so we'll just go through this briefly. But it outlawed discrimination in all public areas, places like hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, really all other public accommodations that engaged in interstate commerce. You now were not allowed to discriminate under threat of being fined and maybe going out of business. It prohibited discrimination by the government as well, by government agencies that receive federal funding, saying if you want to continue to receive federal funding, you are not allowed to discriminate against people based on race any longer. It also discriminated on it prohibited the discrimination in hiring people for jobs, for employment, on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And it also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that kind of made sure all of these things were being followed throughout the country. One of the major events towards the end of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was called Freedom Summer. This actually took place in Mississippi, all right, so our home state is the home to a lot of the major events of the civil rights movement. That's why the Civil Rights Museum is in Jackson. And this was a volunteer campaign. Freedom Summer was a volunteer campaign by both white people and black people to register as many African Americans in Mississippi to vote as possible. All right, the goal was to register as many black people to vote as possible and to also create what were called freedom schools, basically summer schools for blacks who kind of got a second-rate education in segregated schools during the school year so that they could kind of bridge that gap and be ready to go to the more well-funded, formerly white schools now that schools were being integrated. Okay, so this promoted voter registration and also education. But one huge tragedy took place in Mississippi during Freedom Summer in Neshoba County near Philadelphia, if you've ever been there. Not too far away from here, about an hour from here. And what happened was that three guys, one named James Chaney, the guy in the middle in that missing picture there, he was a black member of the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE. Then you have Andrew Goodman, a white volunteer, and Michael Schwerner, who was a white CORE member. All right, so two white guys and a black guy, all of whom are a part of this Freedom Summer to try to get black people to register to vote. They were arrested in Neshoba County by the sheriff. Now, the sheriff just happened to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, so obviously he was not a big fan of what was happening with Freedom Summer. Now, these men were held in jail for 3 days, and then they were finally released. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. They were finally released, but then, as they were leaving prison, they were ambushed by the KKK. A lot of people think the sheriff might have tipped them off, say, hey, this is when we're releasing them, this is where to find them. But they were ambushed by the KKK, who killed all three of them and buried their bodies. All right, so the KKK at this time was not just a hate group like it is today. It was actually like a terrorist group. Okay, it would actually kill people because of their own political reasons. Okay, for their own political or social agenda. All right, so these three guys were killed and their bodies were buried. Now, finally, their bodies were found by federal law enforcement. The FBI actually had to come down to Mississippi because the sheriff wasn't really doing his job looking for the bodies. And it really shocked the country and kind of opened their eyes to the racial situation in places like Mississippi. All right, so while these three poor guys did die unjustly, their deaths did lead to some better legislation and a lot more people kind of jumping on the bandwagon of the civil rights movement. A year later came the Selma March. Okay, the Selma March, there was a movie called Selma made about this a few years ago. And this was a large group of African Americans who marched from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery in order to protest racial discrimination and demand voting rights, demand the removal of Jim Crow laws and things like that. Now, this peaceful protest turned violent when the policemen would not let this group cross a bridge on their way to Montgomery, and they started to beat a lot of the protesters. A lot of them got beaten very badly by the white police officers. The guy on the ground, his name is John Lewis. He's actually a congressman now in Atlanta, but he got his head kicked in, just terribly injured during what was a peaceful protest. All right, so this really opened people's eyes to what was going on in places like Alabama, and once again led to more people jumping on board the civil rights movement. Because the activists were peaceful and those who were against it a lot of times were violent, it made a lot more people side with the civil rights activists. Okay, so that's why this strategy worked so well. If all of the civil rights activists had been as violent as their oppressors, then the movement wouldn't have gone anywhere because people wouldn't want to be on their side. All right, but a big result of both Freedom Summer and the Selma March was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed. This outlawed racial discrimination at voting stations, Jim Crow laws like the literacy test, the grandfather clause, and the poll tax, and this led to more and more Southern blacks voting. And by this time, in the civil rights movement, unfortunately, some fringe groups of civil rights activists began to turn to violence. They said, you know what, this peaceful way, while it has given us a lot of progress, it's going too slow. It's going way too slow, so we need to take things into our own hands, take matters into our own hands, and bring about social change by any means necessary. Okay? So when Martin Luther King Jr. heard about this and knew what was going on, a lot of people thought, oh, well, he'll be okay with that since they have the same goal. both Martin Luther King and the violent people, they both want segregation to end. They both want Jim Crow to end. They both want civil rights for black people. So sure, Martin Luther King will support them, but he didn't. Okay, Martin Luther King in a speech famously said, "This is the wrong way." He said, "It doesn't matter if your intentions are pure. It doesn't matter if you think the ends justify the means, because they don't. All right, it's the wrong way to go about bringing about positive social change. If you do it through violence, then it's not worth it." All right, so he was very adamant about that, saying you always need to remain peaceful, even if those who are against you are not, because in the end, you'll win. And here today, we see that he was absolutely 100% correct with that. But tragically, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King, at the age of 39, only 39, was shot to death in Memphis by a white supremacist. This was just a horrifying event to the entire country, not just to the black community, but to all the white people who really looked up to him and respected the way that he went about the process of gaining civil rights for black people. All right. And the public reaction to this assassination, specifically in black communities across America, was rioting. Okay, there were deadly riots in 130 different inner cities all across the country as a reaction of anger against MLK's assassination, saying, well, what good is all of this peaceful protest things if it just got him killed? We need to become more violent, maybe, and by any means necessary, bring about this change. But one city, Indianapolis, did not have any rioting, did not have any violence in black communities that night. That was the only major city in all the country that did not have any riots, any violence or things like that on this night that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And the reason why Indianapolis was violence free, is because the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, who at this time was running for president, he was in Indianapolis, and he took this opportunity to speak to a large crowd of African Americans about what had just happened that day, about MLK's death, and he encouraged them to respond with love instead of with violence. He said, hey, I get it. Someone I loved very deeply, my brother, was also killed for no good reason. A good man was assassinated for no good reason, and here, another friend of mine, Martin Luther King, was also assassinated for no reason. And he said, at times like this, we're very tempted to react in anger and violence and the wrong way. But instead, let's respond with love and move on and acquire justice instead of revenge. And Indianapolis, as I said, was the only major city in the U.S. that was completely peaceful that night. So the civil rights movement tragically really changed, and in some ways it ended after Martin Luther King's murder, because in a lot of ways, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. A lot of people saw his assassination as the rejection of his dream. And they said, okay, well, if you're going to reject the dream, you're going to kill the person with the dream, then welcome to the nightmare. All right, and the nightmare kind of was embraced because these violent fringe groups like the Black Panther Party of the civil rights movement, instead of fringe groups anymore, they now became the majority. And you have violence and rioting becoming the new method of protest, right? So all of this great progress that took place during the Civil Rights Movement, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 24th Amendment that outlawed the poll tax, all right? All these great things that happened because of it, all these great events of progress that came about because of the peaceful Civil Rights Movement, all that really kind of ground to a halt with the emergence of violence in the civil rights movement to a very large degree. Okay, so I know I've said this before, but there's a reason why we celebrate Martin Luther King Day every January and we don't celebrate Malcolm X Day or Black Panther Party Day, because Martin Luther King was the most effective and the one really to look up to because of all he was able to accomplish and the purity of his message and of his method. Okay, one of the greatest Americans of all time, and he is missed every day. All right, so that is all I have for you on social movements of the 1960s and the end of the civil rights movement. Let me know if you have any questions about